No one noticed the first spark drifting in a barn. Wind carried it through dry wooden streets. Chicago turned into a single moving fire. Chicago, October 8th, 1871. A city built on wood, ambition, and restless dreams. By then, more than 300,000 people called it home. Merchants, laborers, immigrants, and families chasing opportunity. The city had grown fast, too fast for its own safety. Houses, sidewalks, and even the streets were made of wood. Autumn winds blew dry through the alleys, and every home glowed with oil lamps and coal stoves. It was a city waiting for one mistake. That Sunday evening was unusually warm. The air felt heavy, still. People went about their routines. Families gathered for supper. Men played cards in saloons. Children dozed in narrow beds. Across the city, life seemed perfectly ordinary. On the city's south side stood a modest barn behind a small house on DeCoven Street. It belonged to Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. They kept a few cows there, a simple piece of farm life inside a growing metropolis. Inside that barn, a lantern flickered in the dark. A few moments later, the light fell. The dry straw caught fire. In seconds, the flames reached the rafters and spread beyond the wooden walls. A neighbor saw the glow and shouted for help. Buckets were filled. Men ran toward the fire, but the wind had already chosen its direction. From the west it came, pushing the flames east and north toward the heart of Chicago. When the first alarm bell rang, the city's firemen were already weary. They had fought a major fire the night before, and their horses were exhausted. Still, they rushed into the night. They did not yet know what they were riding toward. As the clock neared 9 o'clock, the fire leapt from house to house. Shingles burst into sparks that flew across the narrow streets. The night air, dry and restless, carried those sparks further than anyone thought possible. Onlookers gathered, drawn by curiosity, unaware that they were standing in the path of a storm. They watched as the glow grew brighter, the roar louder. The city's skyline turned orange, reflected in the river like a mirror of fire. By the time the firefighters reached the south side, the blaze had already consumed several blocks. Their hoses sputtered. The pressure was weak, and water could not reach the highest flames. Wind gusted hard enough to bend the streams of water backward. Men shouted orders, but the noise of the fire drowned every voice. The air was thick with ash and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not for evening prayer, but for warning. Within an hour, entire streets were burning. People began to flee. Carts rattled down the cobblestones, loaded with furniture and frightened children. Dogs barked. Windows shattered from the heat. One witness later said it felt as if the fire had a mind of its own. It did not just burn, it hunted. The city that had once glowed with promise was now lit by a fire that refused to stop. The flames reached the yards of the O'Leary home, then leapt across the street, jumping from block to block with terrifying ease. Somewhere above the chaos, the night sky glowed red, then gold, then black again as smoke blotted out the moon. A warm wind howled through the streets, feeding the inferno. People ran, some carrying children, others carrying nothing at all. By midnight, the fire had grown beyond control. The men of the Chicago Fire Department fought bravely, but their engines could not keep up. The flames moved faster than the horses that pulled them. In the heart of the city, lamps still burned in houses not yet touched by fire. Families looked out their windows, confused by the strange red glow in the distance. They would soon understand. The Great Chicago Fire had begun, and the city, built on wood and hope, would never be the same again. The alarm bells rang through the city. At first, many thought it was another small fire, a common sight in a city built of wood. But within minutes, people realized this was something different. The flames were moving too fast. The heat was too intense. From Decoven Street, the fire leapt northward, crossing alleys, devouring entire blocks in minutes. Wooden fences carried the blaze like fuses. Roofs caught fire, windows burst, and the air filled with burning soot. The wind turned fierce, gusting over 30 miles per hour, sending waves of flame ahead of themselves. The firemen worked desperately, dragging their hoses across streets already lined with embers. But the water pressure was failing. Pipes melted in the heat, and cisterns ran dry. Men coughed and stumbled, their faces blackened by smoke. By midnight, the fire had reached the business district. Gas lamps exploded one after another. The courthouse, made of stone and thought to be fireproof, began to burn from the inside out as its wooden floors caught fire. Documents and ledgers flew from broken windows, turning into sparks in the air. Across the city, people fled their homes. Families pushed carts filled with blankets, mirrors, and photographs, the small pieces of their lives they could carry. Others ran with nothing at all, clutching children or pets as they searched for safety. The streets were chaos. A strong wind carried burning debris across the Chicago River. Many believed the river would stop the fire, but they were wrong. Barges loaded with lumber floated near the banks, and warehouses full of coal lined the shore. When the first sparks landed, they ignited instantly. Now the fire had jumped the river. The city's north side began to burn. It was as if Chicago itself had become one endless flame. Witnesses described the roar of the fire as deafening. Buildings collapsed in waves of thunder. Flames twisted upward like living things, turning night into a storm of orange and red. The sky glowed brighter than dawn. In the midst of it all, there were acts of quiet courage. Firefighters stood their ground even as the buildings around them crumbled. Neighbors helped one another drag water barrels, form bucket lines, and rescue the injured. But for every life saved, dozens more were lost in the smoke and confusion. The city's streets became rivers of heat. Iron melted, cobblestones cracked. Even horses panicked, breaking free of their reins and running blindly into the smoke. Those who could fled toward the open ground by the lake. On the north side, a young school teacher named Emma led her students through the burning streets. She held the smallest by the hand, shouting their names to keep them close. Each turn seemed blocked by flame. The only light ahead came from the fire itself. Elsewhere, a builder named John Harper carried his injured neighbor across a bridge that trembled from the heat. He could feel the planks smoldering beneath his boots. He did not stop. The fire raged through the night without rest. People prayed aloud, some whispering, others shouting into the roar of destruction. Church steeples burned like candles. When the bells fell, their iron tongues struck the ground, still ringing. By 2 in the morning, the city's downtown was gone. The courthouse tower collapsed in a wave of sparks. The telegraph office, the newspaper presses, the theaters, all vanished in the glow. There was no way to call for help, no lines left to send a message. At last, the wind shifted. For a brief moment, the flames slowed, and the people dared to hope it might end. But another gust came from the southwest, fierce and relentless, and the inferno roared back to life. The fire marched north again, consuming what was left of the city. The night sky above Chicago was a single sheet of flame, seen for miles across the prairie. Sailors on Lake Michigan said it looked like the sun had risen in the middle of the night. For the people below, it felt like the end of the world. The air burned to breathe, and the streets themselves glowed beneath their feet. Everything that could burn, burned. And yet, through the chaos, some still moved forward, toward the lake, toward any place where the fire could not reach. By dawn, more than a third of the city was gone, but the fire was not finished. By early morning, the fire had swallowed nearly everything south of the river. It moved with terrifying speed, jumping streets and rooftops, spreading like a red tide through the heart of Chicago. The wind roared, driving walls of flame into every corner of the city. People fled in all directions. Some went west toward open fields. Others ran north, believing the river might still protect them. Many had only the clothes they wore, faces streaked with ash, eyes wide with disbelief. The streets were jammed with wagons, carts, and people on foot. Mothers held children close. Old men pulled at horses too frightened to move. Dogs barked and vanished into the smoke. The air was alive with sparks. Every breath tasted of soot and salt. Even the sky had turned orange, a swirling canopy of smoke and flame. The fire made its own wind now, strong enough to lift burning shingles and carry them for blocks. At the river, panic spread. Bridges were already burning. Crowds pushed forward anyway, desperate to cross before the wood gave way. Some fell into the water below. Others clung to floating debris as the current carried them north. A few managed to reach the other side, only to find more fire waiting for them. The warehouses along the riverfront had ignited, sending black columns of smoke into the air. Tar, paint, and kerosene, everything that could burn, fed the flames. Emma, the schoolteacher, stumbled through the chaos with a handful of students. Their faces were black with soot. She told them to cover their mouths with cloth and keep moving toward the lake. Behind them, the city roared like a storm. At one point, they passed a row of homes already burning. Glass shattered, and the roofs collapsed one after another. Emma turned her face away from the heat. The children followed her, silent except for their coughing. John Harper, the builder, carried his injured neighbor toward the same direction. He could feel the man's heartbeat against his shoulder. Behind them, the bridge they had crossed gave a final groan and fell into the river, swallowed by flame. The fire chased them relentlessly. Each gust of wind brought new sparks, new danger. It was as if the city itself refused to let them go. All around, the sights and sounds were unbearable. Walls collapsing, horses screaming, people calling out names lost in the roar. The fire was not just a disaster. It was alive, hungry, consuming everything in its path. By mid-morning, tens of thousands had gathered near the lakefront. The only place left untouched was the open sand by the water. Families crowded together, shielding their faces from the heat. Some waded into the shallow waves, holding children or bundles of clothes. From there, they watched the city burn. The skyline they once knew disappeared behind a curtain of fire. Whole districts, churches, theaters, hotels fell in glowing waves of collapse. For a moment, the wind shifted again, sending smoke and sparks out over the lake. The people cried out, afraid the fire would follow even there. But the water held it back. At last, there was somewhere the flames could not go. Hours passed. Ash rained down like snow. People sat in silence, numb, exhausted. They could still hear the city crackling behind them, a sound that would never leave their memory. As night fell again, the glow on the horizon pulsed like a heartbeat. Some prayed softly. Others simply watched, too tired to move. Emma wrapped her students in blankets she had found near the shore. She told them the worst would soon be over. Her voice trembled, but the children believed her.
John helped others gather driftwood for small fires, just enough to keep warm. He looked back once toward where his workshop had stood. Nothing remained but a red haze and the faint outline of chimneys against the sky. All through the night the fire burned northward, devouring what little remained. The sound of collapsing walls echoed over the water. Each crash was a reminder of how much had been lost. And yet, even in that moment of ruin, the people endured. They had escaped the fire, but not its shadow. When morning came again, the sun rose over a city of smoke and silence. The fire that had started in a barn had destroyed 3 square miles of Chicago, but the survivors still lived, cold, hungry, and alive. They had made it through the fire. Now they had to face what came after. When dawn broke on October 10th, 1871, the wind had finally died. The roar of the fire faded into a deep, uneasy silence. Smoke drifted across the lake in slow gray waves. Where a city had once stood, there was now only ruin. From the shore, survivors watched the sunlight struggle through a sky of soot. They could not yet believe what they saw. Block after block had vanished. Houses, shops, and churches gone. Even the streets had disappeared beneath the ash. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet charcoal. Ash fell like snow, coating the sand, the trees, and the faces of those who sat staring at what remained. Here and there, blackened walls leaned against one another, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. The city's proud landmarks were gone. The courthouse was a shell. The water tower stood alone, surrounded by miles of smoking debris. Telegraph poles hung in twisted angles, their wires melted and useless. People wandered through the ruins as if walking through a dream. Some called out names of family members. Others moved in silence, searching for anything familiar. A doorframe, a fence post, a piece of furniture that had somehow survived. The fire had burned for nearly 30 hours. It had consumed more than 2,000 acres, destroyed 17,000 buildings, and left 100,000 people without homes. 1/3 of Chicago's population now had nowhere to go. Relief stations began to form along the edges of the burned district. The first tents appeared by the lake, then on the open grounds to the west. Volunteers handed out bread and blankets. Buckets of water passed from hand to hand. Among them was John Harper, his face lined with exhaustion. He worked beside strangers, helping raise makeshift shelters out of boards and cloth. For him, the task of rebuilding began before the smoke had even cleared. Not far away, Emma and her students sat near a small fire on the beach. The children were quiet, wrapped in borrowed coats. Emma looked toward the city, unable to find the street where her school had stood. Only ashes remained. Later that day, she walked into the ruins, stepping carefully between smoldering beams. Amid the wreckage, she found a single blackboard, cracked but still standing against a wall of brick. She picked up a piece of chalk from the ground and wrote one word: hope. A man passing by stopped and watched her. He said nothing. Then he smiled, the first smile anyone had seen that day. For the survivors, there was no time for mourning. They needed food, water, and warmth before night returned. They built fires not for destruction, but for comfort. and as the first stars appeared, the glow from those small flames became a quiet answer to the inferno that had destroyed their city. Messages spread quickly across the country. From Milwaukee, from St. Louis, from New York, aid began to arrive. Trains carried bread, blankets, and lumber. Money poured in from as far away as London and Paris. The world had watched Chicago burn, and now it reached out to help her rise. In the following days, makeshift hospitals filled with the injured. Women sewed bandages, men cleared streets, children searched for family members among the survivors. Everywhere there was exhaustion, and yet something else began to take shape beneath it, a determination that the fire would not be the end. On the third day, a preacher stood on a pile of bricks that had once been his church. He spoke to the crowd that gathered around him. He said, "We will rebuild, and we will build stronger." The people listened in silence, then nodded. There were no cheers, only the sound of resolve. From the ruins of despair came the first whispers of renewal. Chicago was still alive, wounded but breathing. The fire had taken everything except the will to start again. By the end of that week, the city's streets were filled with wagons carrying lumber, stone, and supplies. Temporary housing appeared along the river. The first signs of rebuilding began before the smoke had even cleared. And though the air still smelled of ash, the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the emptiness. Each strike was a small declaration: the city would endure. For those who had lost everything, the question was no longer why the fire had come, but how they would rise from its ashes. The fire was over, but its shadow lingered. For days, smoke continued to rise from the ruins. The once proud city of Chicago was silent, broken, and gray. Yet beneath that silence, something was stirring, the determination to begin again. Across the burned district, people worked side by side to clear debris. They formed lines to pass bricks, gathered nails, and salvage what little remained from the rubble. No one waited for permission. Rebuilding began before the ashes cooled. In the first week, tents and wooden shacks appeared where elegant homes once stood. Merchants reopened their shops and wagons. Carpenters built makeshift bridges to replace the ones that had burned. The city's pulse, faint but steady, began to beat again. John Harper joined a crew of builders along the river. They worked long days, lifting timber, mixing mortar, setting new foundations. His hands bled, his voice grew hoarse, but he refused to stop. Each wall raised felt like an act of defiance against the fire that had tried to erase them. Emma reopened her classroom under a large canvas tent. The ground was still warm from the ashes beneath. Children sat on crates and old benches, using scraps of paper as notebooks. She began each lesson with the same words: "We will build a better city." News of their efforts spread quickly. Donations arrived by train, food, clothing, even books for Emma's students. Architects came from other states, eager to design a safer Chicago. They spoke of fireproof materials, of wider streets, of buildings made of brick and iron instead of wood. The idea of a new city began to take shape. People who had lost everything now carried hammers instead of tears. Men rebuilt churches. Women planted flowers outside their tents. Children laughed again, chasing one another through streets still marked by soot. By winter, more than 5,000 temporary homes had been built. Smoke still rose from the ruins, but so did hope. It was fragile at first, a quiet, steady kind of hope that grew stronger with each sunrise. John worked through the cold, his breath white in the morning air. One evening, as he walked past the river, he stopped to watch the reflection of new lamps glowing in the water. For the first time in weeks, the city looked alive. He thought of his lost workshop, of neighbors gone, and he whispered to himself, "We're still here." Emma's school grew, her tent replaced by a small wooden building donated by a group of teachers from New York. She hung a simple sign above the door, Chicago Primary School No. 1. Every morning she looked at it and smiled. For her, it was proof that learning, like rebuilding, was a form of survival. Spring came early the next year. Grass sprouted through cracks in the charred ground. Birds returned to the city. And along the river, the skeletons of new buildings rose higher each day. One of the first permanent structures to be completed was the new courthouse, built entirely of stone and iron. It stood as a monument to what had been lost and to what could never be destroyed again. Newspapers began to call it the Phoenix City. Reporters wrote that Chicago had risen from its ashes faster than anyone believed possible. In less than a year, the downtown district hummed with construction, business, and trade once again. At night, the glow of lanterns replaced the glow of fire. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the narrow streets like a song of endurance. The people had turned catastrophe into creation. For Emma, every lesson she taught felt like a brick placed in the foundation of the city's future. For John, every bridge he built was a promise that Chicago would never fall so easily again. And as spring turned to summer, the city that had been reduced to ash began to shine once more. Shops reopened, music returned to the theaters, and laughter filled the air. The fire had taken their homes, but not their heart. Chicago was no longer a city of wood and risk. It had become a city of iron, stone, and resilience. The same fire that once destroyed it had forged something stronger. Hope was no longer just a word written on a broken blackboard. It was alive in every building, every voice, every sunrise that touched the new skyline. The people of Chicago had rebuilt their city, but more than that, they had rebuilt themselves. 2 decades passed. The scars of the Great Chicago Fire faded, but the memory never left the city. Out of the ashes, a new skyline rose, taller, stronger, brighter than anything imagined before. The city that had once burned to the ground now reached for the clouds. By the 1890s, Chicago was no longer a story of tragedy. It had become a story of rebirth. Steel towers climbed where wooden homes had fallen. The streets widened, the bridges gleamed with iron and stone, and along the lakefront the city shone like a promise fulfilled. Visitors came from around the world to see what had been built. They walked through new parks, grand hotels, and the towering buildings that seemed to touch the sky. Architects called it a revolution, the birth of the modern city. For Chicago, it was proof that destruction could become the foundation of greatness. Among those who still lived from that terrible night were Emma and John. They had grown older, their faces lined with the years, yet their spirits unbroken. Emma continued teaching in one of the city's new schools, now made of brick and glass. Each morning she stood before her students and told them about the night Chicago burned, not to frighten them, but to remind them how far they had come. Sometimes she would pause and look out the window, watching the sun rise over the lake. The light reminded her of that other glow, the one she had seen from the shore all those years ago.
only this light brought peace instead of fear. John had become a respected builder, known for his bridges and careful designs. He liked to say that Chicago's strength lay not in its materials, but in its people. He often visited the new courthouse, the one built of stone, and ran his hand along its cool walls. "This time," he would say quietly, "it will last." Every October, the city marked the anniversary of the fire. Church bells rang in remembrance of those who had perished, and in honor of those who had rebuilt. The sound was softer now, no longer an alarm, but a hymn. It carried across the rooftops, echoing over the lake where survivors once huddled in fear. Children learned about the Great Fire in school books. They read of the night when their city nearly vanished and how it rose again. For them, it was history, but for the older generation, it was memory, alive and vivid. The newspapers called Chicago the city that learned from fire. Its new buildings were marvels of innovation, the first skyscrapers in the world. They stood as symbols not only of progress, but of resilience. The people of Chicago had turned loss into legacy. For Emma, the lesson was simple. One evening, after class, she wrote on the blackboard, "Fire teaches, rebuilding defines." Her students copied the phrase carefully, not yet realizing they were part of that same story. John died before the century turned, his work complete. When they laid him to rest, the sound of construction still echoed through the city. Cranes and hammers filled the air, continuing the work he had started. It was, he might have said, the music of renewal. As for Emma, she lived to see the dawn of a new century. From her window she could see the reflection of electric lights dancing on Lake Michigan. The same lake that had once mirrored a burning city now reflected a city reborn. She smiled and whispered a single word, "Beautiful." Chicago's skyline stood as a monument to everything lost and everything gained. The fire had taken homes, churches, and lives, but it had also given something in return, the vision of what could rise when people refused to surrender. Today, the story of the Great Chicago Fire endures, not as a tale of destruction, but as a testament to resilience. It reminds us that catastrophe does not define a city, its response does. Each generation still walks those same streets, built over ground once scorched and black. They walk unaware that beneath their feet lies the memory of that night, buried but not forgotten. And when the wind rises off the lake and the lights of the city shimmer on the water, it is easy to imagine for just a moment that the fire still burns, not in destruction, but in spirit. A steady, quiet flame that lives on in every act of courage, every building raised, every dream rebuilt. Chicago, the city reborn in fire, a city that refused to die.